It started with messages on Snapchat, teenage arguments, harsh words thrown back and forth across screens, pride clashing with ego, the kind of beef that happens every day between young people online. But when those online arguments turned into real-world threats, and a fight was arranged to settle it, no one could have imagined how far it would go. One 15-year-old boy showed up thinking it would be nothing more than a few punches thrown. A typical teenage fight. What he didn't know was that he was walking straight into an ambush he would never walk away from. This is the tragic story of Reece Tansey, a loyal friend who got caught in the middle of someone else's beef, who felt the pressure of everyone watching online, who couldn't back down without looking weak, who thought he was going to a fair fight. But one of the boys he was meeting had brought a kitchen knife, and barely a minute after stabbing Reece 6 times, that boy pulled out his phone and filmed the bloodied weapon, adding a single caption that shows just how callous teenage violence can be. Muppet. He thought it was just a fight. They brought a knife, and by the time the sun came up, a 15-year-old was dead. How does a Snapchat argument become murder? How does peer pressure and social media turn teenage beef into a fatal ambush? And what does this tragedy tell us about the dark side of online conflict and youth violence? But before we reveal how online words became real violence and how a boy's final act ensured justice, if you're moved by stories that show the devastating consequences of social media beef and teenage violence, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because Reece Tanzy's story is one that needs to be heard. The Snapchat feud, May 3rd, 2021. May 3rd, 2021. A Monday afternoon. 4 15-year-old boys in their separate homes, phones in hand, messages flying back and forth on Snapchat. This is how it started. Not with violence, not with weapons, with words on a screen. The main players were Mark Newthall, James White, Callum, and Reece Tansey. 4 teenage boys whose lives were about to collide in the most devastating way. It began as a petty argument between Mark, James, and Callum. The kind of beef that teenagers get into all the time. Someone said something, someone took offense. Words were exchanged, insults thrown, threats made. Mark and James were close friends, and their real issue was with Callum. They didn't like him, didn't respect him, wanted to put him in his place. But Callum had someone in his corner, a loyal friend who wouldn't let him face this alone. Reece Tansey. Reece got dragged into the chaos simply by standing by his friend, by refusing to let Callum deal with Mark and James alone, by showing loyalty when it would have been easier to stay out of it. Mark and James had no real problem with Reece. None at all. Their beef wasn't with him. But they didn't like that he stood by Callum. They didn't like that he refused to back down or abandon his friend. So Reece became part of the conflict. Not by choice, but by loyalty. For hours, the messages flew back and forth. Threats escalating. Tension building. The kind of argument that feeds on itself, growing bigger and more serious with every exchange. Finally, after all that back and forth, Mark and James managed to convince Reece and Callum to meet them in person, to settle it face to face, with fists instead of words. Reece and Callum were reluctant, hesitant. They agreed to nothing more than a fight, a teenage scrap, some punches thrown and then everyone goes home, or so they thought. But here's where social media changed everything, where the digital world made this so much worse than it would have been in the past. Word spread quickly, screenshots shared, messages forwarded. Soon everyone seemed to know about it. The fight between Mark, James, Reece, and Callum was the talk of their social circle. Reece started receiving messages from other people, friends, acquaintances, people asking for updates, wanting to know when it was happening, asking who would win, treating it like entertainment. The pressure was building with every notification, every message, every person watching and waiting. And with the situation now completely public, out in the open for everyone to see, Reece, who had hesitated from the start, felt like he had no choice but to go through with it. He couldn't back down now, not with everyone watching, not with all these people waiting to see what would happen. If he didn't show up, he'd look weak. He'd look scared. He'd be labeled a coward. That's what peer pressure does. That's what social media does to teenage conflicts. It makes private arguments public. It makes backing down feel impossible. It turns everyone into an audience waiting for a show. By that night, all 4 boys had agreed to meet. The time was set, the location chosen. Everyone knew it was happening. But only 3 of them would survive until morning. Peer pressure can kill, and this time, it literally would. The setup. The early hours of May 4th. Most of the neighborhood asleep, streets quiet and dark. But 4 teenage boys are wide awake. They'd been in contact all night. Messages going back and forth. The tension building toward this moment. And now it was finally time. Time to meet. Time to fight. Time to settle this beef once and for all. Reece Tansey left his house in the darkness, walking alone through the quiet streets toward Walker Avenue, the agreed meeting spot, where this was supposedly going to be a fair fight between teenagers trying to prove themselves. At the same time, Mark Newthall and James White set out from their homes, also heading toward Walker Avenue, also walking through the dark. But their intentions were no longer what they'd claimed. What was supposed to be a simple teenage fight, some punches thrown and everyone goes home, had shifted into something far darker, something far more sinister. Because before leaving his house, James White made a decision that would change everything. He went to his kitchen, opened a drawer, and took out a large kitchen knife, 10 to 12 centimeters long, sharp, deadly. This was never going to be a fair fight. This was never going to be just punches thrown. James had armed himself with a weapon capable of killing, and he had every intention of using it. As Reese walked through the quiet streets, probably feeling nervous, probably wishing this wasn't happening, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Callum, his friend, the person whose beef this originally was. The person Reese was showing up to support. The message said he wasn't coming. Callum had decided to stay in bed. He was abandoning Reese, leaving him to face Mark and James completely alone. Reese was now on his own, 2 against 1. And backing out didn't feel like an option anymore. Too many people were watching. Too many people knew about this. Too many screenshots had been shared. Too many messages had been sent. Mark and James had already warned him. They'd made it clear in their messages. If he didn't show up, they'd make sure everyone knew. They'd spread it around that Reese was scared, that he backed down, that he was all talk online but wouldn't show up in person. That kind of reputation can follow a teenager forever. In their world, in their social circles, being labeled a coward is devastating. So even though Reese had admitted in messages that he couldn't win in a 2-on-1 fight, even though he was scared, even though he probably wanted nothing more than to turn around and go home, he was still determined to go. He couldn't be seen as the one who backed down. What Reese didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know as he walked through those dark streets, was that James wasn't relying on numbers that night. He had something far deadlier on his side, a knife. He was walking into a trap, and he had no idea. What happened next took just minutes, but those minutes would end a life and destroy several others. The ambush, the attack. All 3 boys arrived at Walker Avenue around the same time. Reese walking up alone, Mark and James arriving together. The atmosphere shifted instantly. You could feel the tension. The violence hanging in the air. Something was about to happen. James and Mark locked eyes on Reese, and without any warning, without any words exchanged, without any chance for Reese to prepare or defend himself, James made his move. He pulled out the kitchen knife, 10 to 12 centimeters of cold steel gleaming in the darkness. Reese saw the blade, and in that instant, everything changed. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't what he'd agreed to. This was something else entirely. Pure terror surged through him. Survival instinct kicked in. He turned and ran, fear propelling his legs as fast as they could go, running for his life through the dark streets, heart pounding, breath ragged, knowing that behind him, someone with a knife was giving chase. James ran after him, hunting him like prey, with Mark following close behind. Both of them pursuing a terrified 15-year-old boy through the darkness. Mid-chase, James closed the distance, got close enough to reach Reese, and he plunged the blade into Reese's body. The pain was instant, searing, devastating. But somehow Reese kept running. adrenaline and fear keeping him moving even as blood began to flow. The chase continued. Reese running, James pursuing, the knife already bloodied. Then Reese tripped. His legs gave out, or he stumbled, or the injury was too much. He fell hard to the pavement, hitting the ground, vulnerable, defenseless, screaming in agony. A 15-year-old boy crying out in pain on a dark street. But James wasn't finished. He struck again, the blade going in, then again, and again. 6 stab wounds total across Reese's body, each one potentially fatal, all of them devastating. Blood pooling beneath him on the pavement. Somehow, through strength that's almost impossible to imagine, Reese managed to get to his feet one more time. Blood soaking his clothes, life draining from his body, barely clinging to consciousness. He staggered away in the opposite direction, each step an agony, each breath a struggle. But he was moving, fighting to survive even though his body was failing. Moments later, operating on pure survival instinct, Reese reached a nearby house. He banged desperately on the door with whatever strength he had left. 2 men rushed out, seeing a teenage boy covered in blood, collapsing before their eyes. Reese gasped out his own name. Reece Tansey. Then, with what must have been his final conscious thought, his final act of will, he uttered the names of his attackers. Mark. James. He made sure they would be identified, made sure justice would be possible, used his dying breaths to name the boys who had done this to him. Then he collapsed on the doorstep. A 15-year-old boy dying in front of strangers who desperately tried to save him. Meanwhile, James and Mark were already walking away, already heading home. Barely a minute had passed since James had first pulled out that knife. And then James did something that shows just how callous, just how disconnected from reality, just how utterly lacking in remorse he was. He pulled out his phone. He filmed the bloodied kitchen knife, blood still wet on the blade, evidence of what he'd just done. And he added a single caption: Muppet. As if this was funny. As if murder was a joke. As if taking someone's life was entertainment worth sharing on Snapchat. He sent the video to a few people, his friends, people he wanted to impress, and he saved it to his Snapchat library, documenting his own crime like it was a trophy. The generation that documents everything had just documented a murder. Then they hid the knife somewhere and went their separate ways home, probably thinking they'd gotten away with it, probably thinking they were clever. But Reese's final words would seal their fate. Those names he gasped out with his dying breath would ensure they'd be caught. 15 years old, dying on a stranger's doorstep, stabbed 6 times over social media beef, but still brave enough to name his killers, still strong enough to make sure justice would be done. The death and investigation. The 2 strangers who'd opened their door worked desperately to save Reese, trying to stop the bleeding, calling for help, doing everything they could. Paramedics arrived within minutes, working frantically on the pavement, trying to stabilize him, trying to keep him alive long enough to get to hospital. But the injuries were too severe, too many stab wounds, too much blood loss, too much damage to vital organs. Despite their desperate efforts, Reece Tansey died at the scene. A 15-year-old boy, someone's son, someone's friend, gone over an argument on Snapchat. He was later transferred to Salford Royal Hospital, where he was formally pronounced deceased at 5:45 in the morning. As the sun came up on May 4th, 2021, Reese's family received the call that would shatter their world forever. A mother's son, a friend, a child, gone. Within just 3 hours of the murder, police were already deep into the investigation. And they had something crucial. Names. The names Reese had given with his dying breath. Mark and James, the boys who attacked him. And soon, the tips started flooding in. Other teenagers coming forward. People who'd seen the Snapchat messages. People who knew about the planned fight. Reports that Mark and James had been messaging people the day before, trying to find Reese's home address. Evidence of planning. Evidence of intent. With 2 names confirmed from multiple independent sources, investigators knew exactly who they were looking for. Officers contacted Reese's secondary school for more information. They quickly discovered that Reece and one of their suspects, James White, had attended the same school. The school provided James's home address. Police prepared to make an arrest. But when they arrived at his house, they were told something unexpected. James had already turned himself in at the police station, accompanied by his parents. Perhaps his parents had seen the news. Perhaps they'd guessed. Perhaps James had told them what he'd done. With James now in custody, police immediately turned their attention to Mark Nuthall. Investigators had already located an address for him. Officers were already en route to his home. When they arrived and arrested Mark, he repeatedly claimed he'd done nothing wrong, that he was innocent, that this had nothing to do with him. He was taken into custody for questioning. During his interview, Mark provided a written statement. He claimed he'd received a message from James asking if he wanted to come along because James was going to have a fight with Reece Tansey. He said he saw James throw about 3 punches at Reece, just punches, nothing more. And at no point did he see James in possession of a knife. He didn't know that Reece had been stabbed. He was just there watching a fight. That was his story. And for a moment, maybe the detectives thought he might stick with it. But when they pressed further, when they asked harder questions, Mark's responses changed dramatically. "Let's get real now, Mark. Tell us, what is your role in this?" No comment. "Did you touch the knife?" No comment. "If we find that knife, is it going to have your DNA on it?" No comment. "Have you handled that knife?" No comment. "He's got 6 wounds. He's covered in blood." Come on. No comment. "Is there anything you want to tell the family of Reece?" Nope. "Any remorse at all for what's happened to Reece?" No comment. Every question met with silence or denial. No remorse, no accountability, no humanity. James White was equally silent during his interviews. Police showed him social media evidence indicating this was a prearranged fight between him, Mark Nuthall, and Reece Tansey. Screenshots of the messages, evidence of the planning. Proof that this wasn't some random encounter. When asked what issue he had with Reece Tansey, his solicitor stated that his client would remain silent. 2 days in custody. Both boys saying almost nothing of value. And police still hadn't recovered the weapon. But the digital evidence would speak for them, because they'd documented everything. The knife hunt and digital evidence. After 2 days of mostly silence from both suspects, investigators were growing frustrated. They had the names, they had witness statements, they had social media evidence, but they didn't have the murder weapon. Then, without warning, James White broke his silence. Calmly, as if discussing something completely ordinary, he told officers he was ready to take them to the place where he'd hidden the knife. Police took him to an area near Bishop's Road. James described what he'd done, climbing up a muddy section, burying the knife, walking in a straight line before spotting a rock and a tree trunk. Officers spent the entire day searching the area James had led them to, combing through every inch, looking under rocks, digging in the mud, searching near trees. But there was no sign of the knife. Nothing. The search continued into the following day. More officers, more equipment, more thorough searching. Still nothing was found. In the end, the weapon was never recovered. James had either lied about the location, forgotten exactly where he'd hidden it, or hidden it somewhere so well that it couldn't be found. But what detectives uncovered proved just as crucial as finding the knife itself. Digital evidence. The video James had recorded of the bloodied knife. Blood visible on the blade. The caption, "Muppet," showing his mindset. His complete lack of remorse. A series of incriminating Snapchat messages exchanged between the boys in the hours leading up to the attack. The planning, the threats, the arranging of the meeting. All documented in their own words. All saved on servers even when they thought they'd deleted them. The technology that had enabled the beef, that had made the conflict public, that had created the peer pressure that made Reece feel he couldn't back down. That same technology preserved the evidence of their crime. They thought they'd hidden the knife. They thought they'd destroyed the evidence. But they documented everything else. Every threat, every plan, and even the bloody aftermath. They filmed their own crime and shared it on social media. Justice and aftermath. Both Mark Nuthall and James White were charged with murder. They were remanded in custody to await trial. In court, both boys pleaded not guilty, claiming innocence, denying responsibility, trying to avoid consequences for what they'd done. But the jury saw through it. They saw the evidence, the Snapchat messages, the video of the bloodied knife, the witness statements. Reese's dying words naming his attackers. James White was found guilty of murder. The jury determined that he'd armed himself with a knife, hunted down a 15-year-old boy, and stabbed him 6 times. Deliberate, calculated, murder. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Mark Newthall was found guilty of manslaughter. The jury found that while he hadn't wielded the knife himself, he was part of the attack. He'd participated. He'd encouraged it. He'd been there. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. As of now, Mark Newthall has been released from custody. He's served his time and is back in society, living his life while Reese can't live his. James White remains behind bars, and he's continued to find trouble even in prison. While serving his sentence, he's returned to court multiple times for additional offenses. Wounding with intent, possession of an offensive weapon, false imprisonment, a fray, the pattern of violence continuing, the inability to control his aggression, the same traits that led him to bring a knife to a teenage fight, continuing to manifest behind bars. For Reece Tanzy's family, no sentence brings him back. No verdict returns their son. No amount of prison time undoes what happened that night. 15 years stolen. A future erased. Birthdays never celebrated. A life never lived. All over messages on Snapchat, and boys who couldn't let an argument go. The bigger picture in closing. This case shows us the dark side of social media and teenage violence in the modern age. Online arguments becoming real-world violence. Screens creating distance that makes threats feel less real until suddenly they're devastatingly real. Peer pressure magnified by digital witnesses, everyone watching, everyone waiting to see what happens. Making backing down feel impossible even when it's the smart thing to do. Reese felt trapped by the public nature of the beef. He couldn't be seen as a coward, couldn't have everyone thinking he was scared. Had to show up even though he knew it was 2-on-1, even though he was terrified. That's what social media does to teenage conflicts. It makes them public performances. It creates audiences. It makes reputation feel more important than safety. And James documented his crime like it was a trophy, filming the bloodied knife, adding a caption, sharing it like entertainment. The generation that documents everything, that shares everything, that treats life as content to be posted, had just documented a murder. Ironically, that video became crucial evidence against him. The technology that enabled the beef preserved his crime. The lessons we need to learn from Reese's death are clear. Social media amplifies conflicts. What might have been a brief argument face-to-face becomes an ongoing public feud online. Peer pressure can be deadly when combined with digital witnesses. The need to save face in front of an audience can override common sense and self-preservation. Backing down is often braver than showing up. Walking away from a fight doesn't make you weak, it makes you smart. And knives turn fights into murders. What might have been a few punches and bruises became 6 stab wounds and a death. Weapons escalate everything instantly and irreversibly. Reece Tanzy's final act was naming his killers with his dying breath. Brave until the very end. Making sure justice would be possible even as his own life ended. For parents, this story is a wake-up call. Know what your teenagers are involved in online. Know who they're arguing with. Know if fights are being arranged. Arguments on Snapchat can become real violence. Online beef can lead to real-world tragedy. If this story made you think about the dangers of social media beef and teenage violence, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Dark Truth Files for more true crime documentaries that show the real human cost of online conflicts. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts on how we protect young people from this kind of tragedy. Share this video with parents who need to understand what their teenagers might be facing online. Because Reece Tansey deserves to be remembered. His story needs to be told. And maybe, just maybe, it can prevent the next tragedy. He went for what he thought would be a fair fight. They brought a knife, and a 15-year-old boy never came home. Remember his name, Reece Tansey. A loyal friend, a brave boy, a victim of senseless violence. Gone over Snapchat messages that should never have left the screen.